for joining us today for this Margins to Center webinar, a video dialogue and report on racial equity for survivors. We're absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with the Margins to Center listening sessions that happened last September, with all of you who are joining us, and with our panelists to kind of help facilitate some conversation. So thanks to everyone for being here and bringing your voice to the table. I'm Sara Lee, I'm CSAJ's Director of Research and Programs. I'll be playing the role as tech host and pseudo moderator, though we've kind of got a self-moderating group here. So I just encourage everyone to ask questions, to share your experiences, to react to the conversation, engage with us. So I'm gonna let our panelists introduce themselves, but I do want to say their names. So we have with us today Camille Holmes, Erika Sussman, Lisalyn Jacobs, Muro, Tonya Lovelace, Zoe Flowers, again, myself, Sara, and we're thrilled to have this conversation. So while I pass the baton to Lisalyn, please introduce yourselves. Who are you? Where are you coming from? What's your role in the work? And offer us a question or a thought that you're bringing to the table today so that we can think through that with you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Legal and Policy Director, Lisalyn Jacobs, to introduce herself and a little bit about our REAP project.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much, Sara. Welcome to this sixth in a series of webinars that we have done over the course of roughly the last 2 years under the auspices of our Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors project, also known as REAP, and housed here at the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. As Sara said, I'm Lisalyn Jacobs. I am the Director of Legal and Policy Issues here at CSAJ. And I think it's always important when you begin these conversations to be sort of cognizant of where and how you enter and what you bring with you. So by way of describing myself, I am a preacher's kid and preacher's sister, a lawyer and advocate of nearly 30 years, a mom, the daughter of Panamanian West Indian immigrants, and somebody who is really reflecting in gratitude on the journey that we have taken together doing this work, myself and my colleagues who you're about to meet and others, over the course of the last 2 years. As you can see here, represented across the bottom, CSAJ again sort of is where this work has been housed, but we have done fabulous work with a variety of brilliant partners, several of whom you're going to meet today, but they include Women of Color Network, Inc., the Southwest Center for Law and Policy, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Casa de Esperanza, the Texas Council on Family Violence, and our brilliant consultants, Camille Holmes and Bill Kennedy. I'm now going to turn it over to Erika Sussman for her introductions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisalyn, and thank you so much, Sara. My name is Erika Sussman, and I am the founder and executive director of the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. CSAJ has been in existence for over a decade now, and really we were birthed as a result of some insights surrounding what we saw amongst primarily mainstream lawyers and advocates in the field, and a disconnect between survivors' needs and the interventions and responses that were being provided. And so CSAJ came about in an effort to engage in survivor-centered advocacy and to put that into practice in multiple contexts, the legal context being a primary one of them, but also other contexts as well. CSAJ envisions a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And our mission statement really operates at 3 different levels of impact. We work to promote advocacy approaches that remove systemic barriers, that enhance organizational and community responses, and that improve advocacy practices to better meet the self-defined needs of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. I also feel that it's important in diving into this conversation to provide some sense of where I find myself positioned. And so I would describe myself as a white Jewish woman, feminist, lawyer who identifies more as an advocate than a lawyer, granddaughter of refugees fleeing the Holocaust, single mom of 2 very sweet boys. So with that, I also want to echo my deep gratitude for this group of brilliant minds and advocates that are part of this conversation today, and for all of you who have participated in the listening sessions and who will be engaging with us. Thank you, thank you.
Tonya and Zoe?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tonya Lovelace, and I am the CEO of the Women of Color Network, Inc. And I am very pleased and excited to be here. I'm happy to have everyone on what will prove to be a really wonderful webinar, I'm sure, and dialogue. I can tell you that the Women of Color Network, this is our 21st year as an organization. We were previously a project of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. True to form in sort of the primary underlying theme of our work in terms of leadership, we took our own leadership and became an independent nonprofit in September 2014. And so we have been an independent nonprofit for the past 3 years, moving into our 4th fiscal year now. And the mission of our work is to eliminate violence against all women and their communities by centralizing the voices and promoting the leadership and also wellness of women of color across sovereign nations, the United States and US territories. I'm really pleased to also be joined on this call with Zoe Flowers, and she will be sharing more detail about the Women of Color Network. So if we could go to the next slide, yes.
Thank you. So I'm Zoe Flowers, and I'm the Director of Survivor Programs at the Women of Color Network. And I come to this work after having a long history working at domestic violence coalitions across the country, doing lots of training, lots of technical assistance on several levels before really coming to the understanding that my work really was to center the voices and the wellness and the leadership of women of color, which is what brought me to the network. So I do want to just briefly go over this, the term women of color. So it is the political term, and it surfaced in the movement in the late 70s. And the goal was really to unify all women experiencing multiple layers of marginalization with race and ethnicity as a common issue. However, in the recent years, the term has been questioned by lots and lots of folks for many different reasons related to personal identity and definition, mainly because of the word color is not the primary issue for many women with shared ethnicity and race. And so we acknowledge that. And so we wanted to give a broader definition of women of color that really guides us as an organization. And so as you see here, it's communities that have a shared history of militarism, targets of war, police states, race, class, gender-based oppression, displacement, loss of autonomy, violence as the norm, stolen legacy, economic disenfranchisement, and cultural and racial appropriation and genocide. And I'm also super happy to be talking with you all today. This has been a great experience working with everybody on the team. So I'm excited for the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Mona.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muro. I am a policy coordinator at the Texas Council on Family Violence. I appreciated Erika's introduction and offering kind of the groundwork from where her lens is coming from. And so in that vein, I'm going to share the same. I am a second generation grandchild of Mexican and Spanish lineage. I'm a Latina, a survivor, an advocate, someone who's done on the ground work with domestic violence survivors for close to 10 years in advocacy and crisis intervention, as well as intensive levels of economic work. Currently, I am newer to the Texas Council on Family Violence, which is our statewide coalition for all of our domestic violence domestic violence program members. And the work that I get to work on now is a much more policy and systems focused work perspective. And this is really looking at institutional systems and structures with respect to how these intersections of systems are impacting low-income survivors of domestic violence.
Thanks so much, Mona. Camille.
Hi everyone. I'm Camille Holmes, and I am a facilitator, a coach, and a consultant on issues at the intersection of equity, inclusion, strategy, and leadership. I spent the last 20 years in the nonprofit policy and training sector, connecting legal services, civil rights organizations, community organizers, and researchers to work together and across silos to advance justice for low-income communities and communities of color. And also pointing out that those are not exactly the same communities. I think when we talk about where we come from this work, I am a daughter of the South, transplanted to the North, who had a real sense of what racism looked like that was more than just the words and the outward motions, really thinking about systemic issues and feeling the weight of systems influencing my life and the lives of others. I have also really enjoyed bridging communities. I'm not out of the domestic violence or sexual assault, intimate partner violence community, but I've learned a lot in that space. And I've really enjoyed, one of the things I love doing is bringing people together or connecting across people who have common goals, but different histories, different cultural stories, different rituals, and finding spaces where we can connect and understand, hear one another and support each other in that journey. So this working across this with this set of partners and this group of people has been a very rewarding and wonderful experience. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our dialogue, and I'm just happy to be here this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Camille, and to everyone. I don't know about everyone else on the call, but I'm super excited. This is going to be great. So I am going to invite Zoe and Camille back to help us all kind of enter and ground for the conversation. So Zoe.
Okay, so we do like at WCN, we do like to start most of our conversations and gatherings with a certain level of grounding, just to invite you all, those of you that are on the call, to just be centered into the space. So I would invite you to put everything down that you may have, to place your feet firmly on the floor, the ground, wherever you are. Letting your shoulders relax, letting your neck relax, letting everything relax, and just taking a deep breath in through your nose and exhaling it through your mouth. And one more time in through your nose and out through your mouth. And just trying as best as you can to be centered in this conversation and to listen deeply. We invite you to listen deeply and to share what's in your heart. And again, I just invite you to take one more deep breath in and release. Thank you.
Great. And I am going to get us started first by just talking about what our goal is for today. As others have said before, this has been a 2-year journey of a lot of different activities and webinars and listening sessions and questions back and forth with folks who have engaged with the REAP project and with CSAJ on the ground. And so this conversation wants to lift up particularly those voices we heard this fall from the listening session, but also to dialogue back with the field and, you know, the field, folks on this call, folks on from previous calls, folks who are really interested and committed in engaging racial equity for survivors. We want to dialogue back and forth with you. So we need your voice to do that. We encourage you to use the chat and use the chat often, you know, now and as we go forward in the call. We want you to walk away from the conversation excited and energized, and also equipped with some tools to understand what your work is and to have some ideas about how to energize yourself, listen, adjust, move forward. So if you were a listening session participant, please feel free to and share with us any questions or reflections you had on the call. Identify yourself as a listening participant so we'll know, a listening session participant so we'll know who you are. I mean, you don't have to say, just say that your comment is about the listening session. So we'll connect the dots there. If you are just anyone on the call, if you're new to racial equity analysis, what are some of the questions you're asking yourself? We want to hear your questions, your thoughts as we go through. If you like something, I'm going to use Sarah's words. She's like, type a big yay, Y-A-Y. But in that, we'd love to see those. You know, let us know that you enjoy what you're hearing, or if you have questions about it, you're like, don't know. We want to have this be as engaging as possible. Share your relevant experiences, and hopefully you'll all walk away knowing a little more, understanding a little more about how to be in this work. So I want to jump right in and start off our conversation. I'm going to pose a question to the facilitators and to the presenters, but I also encourage you all to share your thoughts via chat. And I want to do it by starting with a quote. According to the Center for Assessment and Policy Development, racial equity is a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. Racial equity is a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. And then another quote from Glenn Harris, who is the president of the Center for Social Inclusion. Says racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's been out of balance. Racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's been out of balance. If you think about those two, what does racial equity look like for the survivor community? What does racial equity look like for advocates who are working with survivors? What does it look like in your organizations and in the communities where you work? Anyone, I'll go to the panelists.
Well, I'll jump in, Camille. This is Lisa. Probably significantly because we celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday on Monday. That first quote that you spoke to with respect to one's identity not determining their destiny, it invokes for me what Dr. King, I think, was saying to us when he talked about hoping that ultimately that his children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I think as we begin to talk about some of the themes and issues that came up in the report, and as I'm sure the people who are listening to us who do this work every day know, the challenges and the complexities that survivors of domestic violence face as they're navigating systems and institutions, and as they choose, if they choose dealing with law enforcement, can vary drastically according to their identities, whether or not it is that they're a person of color or LGBT or an immigrant or trans or a person with disability or some combination of those many things. So that really is what your quote raised, the quotes that you share raised for me as tied to the work.
Thank you. I'll ask read the second part of that first quote, and it's not the full second part. It says, racial equity includes work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. That includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce or fail to eliminate them. I read that because I love the content of their character quote, and often the conversation stops there, as opposed to thinking about the earlier part of King's speech where he's talking about cashing a check that bounced consistently over time. So other thoughts about, the positive vision for what racial equity looks like in the survivor context, in the survivor advocacy context, in domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy.
So it looks like I can just read this quickly from the chat, and then I can add my own sort of idea. So Maya says, when race and ethnicity other than white no longer means increased vulnerability and less protection from gender-based violence. And so for me, my thought was what happens after the violence, right? So yeah, when race no longer puts us at risk, but then if something does happen, racial equity would mean that if I had to go to shelter or I had to deal with these systems, that my race or ethnicity would not be a factor. That I could as a survivor expect to have the same amount of treatment as someone else. And so if things go wrong, then survivors don't have to filter. Was it because I was an African American? Was it because I was an immigrant? Was it because I was, from this neighborhood? There's so many things that folks have to filter when things happen. So if there was racial equity, those things would not be in place.
Thank you, Zoe. Other thoughts from the panel?
And this is Mona. I would add to Zoe's comment in that we are aspiring to really make the shift from that dominant white culture to living and operating in a really multifaceted culture and an environment where all voices, right, are able to come to that table equally, instead of in the mechanisms that we know are happening now. And so that aspiration really is for all of us to have our voices be equally valued, equally weighed, survivors to have equal access in that lens, and for us to do what we can do to, in our work, really, really make the impacts that we want to with respect to this cultural change and social change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else on the panel?
This is
Gotcha.
Tonya.
I'm looking at, great.
Hi, I'll just say something. One quick thing as well is that I think that racial equity would look to me like that there would be a quest for sort of collective liberation, collective support, so that it wouldn't just be that it is a, that, as Zoe said, you walk into a program, you get your services, you get your needs met, but that there is a quest for that to happen at all times, and that that there is an understanding that there's a higher recognition of liberation, and that would be something that everyone would be sort of collectively engaged and interested in at one time, as opposed to folks sort of being in the moment, sort of on automatic providing services, but that there would be this larger quest for liberation, and that it would be one that that folks would support each other on, and stand in solidarity with each other on, recognizing that there may be differences in identity, and in doing so there would still be a collective approach in addressing that collective support. So there's more I would say, but.
But that is wonderful. I see a finger from Erika, so I'll stop. I'll ask you if you had something there. Can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Just quickly, I also feel like a positive vision of race equity includes a real deep questioning of the way that things are, and an inquiry into why they are that way, and a commitment, as Tonya was saying, a collective commitment to deconstruct those systems in meaningful ways that then allow us to reconstruct the reality that we are, that will be more beneficial for everyone.
No, those are all wonderful comments, and I'm gonna. I want to read the last part of my second quote. It was from the Center for Social Inclusion. Said racial equity is about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's been out of balance. When a system is out of balance, people of color feel the impact most acutely. But to be clear, an imbalanced system makes all of us pay. And having that collective sense of liberation, of liberating ourselves from sort of this reality that seems, confined and separated, and focuses on access instead of outcomes. I'm referring to one of the comments from the chat box. Really moving it, leveling it up for everyone, which takes a lot of work and reimagination. Let me turn it back to Zoe to take us through our next segment.
Sure. So this was an example that we had from one of the participants on the listening session, and they talked about their organization that's working with queer youth of color. And so they have really taken on as an organization that they need to think about the ways that they can provide civil legal services to youth of color, and to queer youth of color. And so the person here says, thinking about everything from language to what it means for you to have lawyers, what the relationship looks like, to what it would be like for this partner organization client base coming into our office, where the office is located, what the office looks like, everything. There's so many opportunities for rich learning there. So again, just having this holistic idea about what your agency, what looks like, what it feels like when people are coming in the door. So that's one example of racial equity that one of our folks gave. So I think we're going to move on to the next slide.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's you and me, Camille. So talking a little bit about the listening sessions. So the listening sessions took place in September of last year, which feels like a lifetime ago already. It was great. We talked with advocates of color who also identified as survivors. We talked to economic justice and policy staff from state coalitions and tribal coalitions who are also people of color and or aspiring allies. And we talked with attorneys, and Camille is going to talk about that, who were sitting at the unique intersections of law, who were people of color and or aspiring allies. And so Camille and I are going to talk a little bit about what we heard during those sessions and the report.
Right. And I'll also invite, I know Lisalyn and I co-facilitated one of the sessions. So Lisalyn, feel free to pop in when you see fit. And I'm not sure who else, if anyone else.
Mona,
did you facilitate? Mona. That's right. I was not on the advocate call, so it's less fresh in my mind. But it was fascinating. One, we facilitated 2 attorney calls, and people are on very different levels of understanding, different levels of experience and awareness. I was struck how attorneys, and I'm not surprised by this, but it's worth noting, attorneys who were in organizations that were either statewide or maybe focused on a systemic issue or in a coalition, they had more time and space and tools to engage in a deeper analysis. This isn't surprising, but it's a reality. They tended to have, an existing analysis that definitely needs work. I don't want to say that, coalitions are the dream place, but I will say that there's just a reality to sort of the frontline demand. And I think that requires sort of creating a different kind of space for people to get the work done. On the other side, there were line attorneys who were making it happen in their organizations in terms of engaging issues of race and racism and racial equity and anti-oppression across the board. And so bully for those folks. I mean, it's great and important work. Do you want me to? I'll do a couple more, and then I'll shift it back to Zoe. I noticed there was a real desire for camaraderie for folks who are doing the work in their organizations but feel isolated. And I think that it's really important that people understand this is not work that's good to do solitary. I mean, there are people who do it, but find friends, find allies, build your own group of folks who can learn with you and grow into the work. And I'll stop there. I'll come back and say some things, but I've talked for a bit. What were some of your observations? So.
Sure, and I think that Mona, if it's okay with you, I can talk about the advocates, and maybe you can talk about the coalitions, just since we did those together.
Sure.
Great. So like Camille said, we did find there are lots of advocates that felt like they were working in isolated situations. Again, these are advocates of color who also are survivors. And so again, lots of isolation. And one of the things we talked about earlier in this conversation about sort of racial inequality, advocates were very clear that the way they presented as survivors of color and how they saw other survivors of color coming into the shelter, the way that the survivors talked, the way they looked, the way they dressed, all impacted the way they were treated within the shelter. They gave examples of disparities between how women of color were being treated in the shelter versus how white women were being treated, whether it was when it came to payments and things like that, payment of bills and helping with resources. They talked about white women having their bills paid outright by the shelters, whereas women of color were put on payment plans and things like that, where if it was a woman of color, the rules were enforced more, being exited from shelters happened more. They also, as advocates working in the shelter, if they try to pose the issue of racial equity or even mention the word race or even talk about racism, we talk to advocates who say they're not even allowed to talk about that because it makes people uncomfortable. And so these are conversations that they can't even have in their organizations. We also women of color, Black women in particular, not being believed by the police, by the courts, when they talked about what happened to them, their experiences being dismissed almost. And this was pretty much across the board, right? And so then we also heard from advocates of color who said they themselves, if they did bring up these issues, it was treated as, well, you're a woman of color, that's why this is important to you. Not that it was an issue that they should be discussing as a shelter, but that it was something that was almost niche to them. So those are just some of the things we heard. There's a lot in the report that I'm sure y'all will dig into and read, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Mona because I don't want to take too much time about the coalitions.
Thank you. So mirroring some of the findings that Zoe just offered, those were definitely pieces that some of the coalition advocates and coalition folks also mirrored for a few reasons. Understanding that coalitions are structured differently. Some coalitions provide direct services to survivors, and others may provide much more of a membership-based support to domestic violence advocates. So we had kind of a bit of a multiple tier response. Some advocates, as I mentioned, mirroring some of the findings that Zoe did, but also discussing within the coalition lens how they were experiencing within that particular entity, the racial inequities. What they identified for a few pieces were seeing the difference within leadership, within advocates of color versus persons who might have been in leadership roles. Also, there was identification and feedback that voices of the advocates of color may not have been received in the same mechanisms as other advocates may have. There was discussion about privilege as well as policies and how to have those conversations since many of those policies or pieces are shaped not by advocates of color, but by predominantly non-advocates of color. So those were a few of the pieces that resonated that I wanted to also offer. And a lot more of this information will be forthcoming as we progress through our conversations, as well as the report is put out.
Great. And Lisalyn, did you have other things to add about the attorney conversation?
I think you all have very well articulated and covered the spectrum of what we heard. I think that it has been consistent because certainly some of us have done some workshops or tried to, elicit some of these discussions in other places where we've been over the last couple of years. And we see the same thing, right? Organizations and individuals in very different places. Some organizations that are literally, having brown bag lunches and talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates and literally saying to their staff of color, this racial equity work is ours to do as white people, and you are welcome to join us and engage if you wish, but we don't want to burden you in that way, right? Some organizations are in that place. You talk to other folks and they're they get it, but there's a discomfort. There's not, if you get from the perspective of some people who are white, who are not used to talking about issues of race, it makes them uncomfortable. And so trying to figure out how to engage in the conversation is challenging. And still for others, they're at a very nascent stage, right? You ask them what they do and they would tell you that they are an advocate or they work in a shelter, et cetera. They are not yet at the point where they are consistently making distinctions, whether or not, they're dealing with a client of color or an immigrant client, and how those particular clients are facing different challenges within the system because of their identity. So very much a spectrum, I think, in terms of what we heard and where people are in terms of engaging with these issues.
This is Sara. I just wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit to offer, I didn't facilitate the calls, but I got to transcribe and kind of talk with folks and to kind of center on, acknowledge kind of the discomfort of some of the white aspiring allies or the advocates and attorneys in the room. And there was one, and as Lisalyn, I'll throw it back to you to kind of talk about how the report might be helpful in locating ourselves, which was a theme that came up. there was one participant that mentioned the need, and I don't remember which call this is on, was on off the top of my head, but a need to be bold. And to me that resonated, I think, in a different way than they intended it, but it resonated to me about what it takes and how to shift, what it takes to build personally my own racial analysis and looking, and like everything else, I've put effort and time into learning and adjusting and working with and coming into spaces that are uncomfortable and figuring out how to work there. So I think that it's a really important towards that collective struggle and liberation vision that Tonya was talking about at the very beginning. So I really took that be bold message, and I hope that to others that are maybe in a struggling and asking questions and trying to figure out how to do this in constrained spaces, kind of a cheerleading perspective there in that being bold and what that might mean for us as we locate ourselves. So I just wanted to offer that, but throw it back to you, Lisalyn, and kind of how we've tried to use the report to think with people about where they might be entering, how to locate where they are. And so can you talk a little bit more about this question about using the report as a tool for locating ourselves in the work?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks, Sara. The report is broken down into a number of sections, and literally when I introduced myself, part of what I said was that people should be cognizant of where and how they enter conversations or situations, or in this case, the report. The question of whether or not racial equity is something that you as an individual, as an advocate, within your organization or in other contexts, if you are newer to the issue, if you've been wrestling with it for some time. The report has a sort of prefatory section, which I think literally will have the signpost, "You are here," to help people identify where it might be useful to begin looking at the report. Obviously, if you're newer, beginning at the beginning and trying to understand literally how we talk about issues like race and racial equity in the context of the work that we do, might be a useful place to start. I think you can see there on your screen some of the wonderful graphics that you will be looking at and introduced to. If you are looking at some of these issues as a lawyer or as a legal aid lawyer, we will try and point you to some of the places and some of the issues that you might want to think about or grapple with in your work. If you are trying to look at some of these issues from an organizational standpoint, there will be feedback and some recommendations for how you might do that. Suggesting that for organizations, you may very well be thinking about, so how do I do racial equity as an external matter? How do I help my clients work through these situations? One of the things that we will encourage you to do is to gaze inward as you are gazing outward. If you are concerned and looking at issues around how your clients' identities may affect the kinds of services and access that they are receiving, we urge you also to look inward, look at the structure of your organizations. Try and have some of these discussions internally, because people placed in different levels in your organizations will have different levels of experience, different feedback to provide based on their own identities. But as centrally, we urge you to look at the structure of your organization in terms of whether or not it is representative of the kind of equity you are trying to accomplish in the world. What does the structure of your organization look like? Is it participatory? Do you have a sort of an open door approach? Do you have staff of disparate identities represented at all levels of your organization, managerial, support staff. You know, what kinds of ways are you thinking about making sure that all of your staff have access to training or experiences, so that your entire organization internally is A, representative, but B, equipped to do the kind of work that you want your organization to be doing and to be known for doing in the world? Mona, do you have thoughts here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the line of conversation with respect to evaluating the internal atmosphere. I think those self-reflections, but also reflections at the organizational level, are incredibly important to really evaluate those kind of power sharing structures, right? To identify how we can operate in those particular environments. Is our structure a consensus building structure, right? Where everyone comes to the table with an equal vote per se? Is it a combination of those types of atmospheres? I do want to make a point and reflect upon something that actually did come up within the coalition calls, was that it's important for us, when we do our own self-reflection, that we acknowledge that in particular folks that are working in coalitions or advocates of color are coming into this self-reflection and personal safety planning. This is a part of that self-reflection, and it involves recognition that there are very real concerns and or potential impacts for folks who might identify or acknowledge inequities within their own internal mechanisms or their own spaces. And to also, acknowledge that much like we make the parallel to survivors, that survivors know their lives best and what the choices they would want to move forward with in their own ways. They are the person who knows that solution best. We want to also acknowledge that advocates working within these different dimensions know what the safest way and most appropriate way is to engage in this conversation and in the work, right? And so I think that that's a really valid point to bring up as we start talking about self-reflection. I would also offer that I would say that an overarching theme, and I'm going to say over because over and over again, because it was such a really fundamental takeaway that I received from the calls, was that it is essential for individuals to do the work on themselves first. So we must begin with that self-reflection before we can move forward. And I relate that to when you're on an airplane and the airline attendants direct folks to put their own airbag on first before assisting others. Our participants on these calls, they mirrored this directive. And really, if we look back on that, it's because we, in order for us to really make the changes that we want to long term, we've got to begin with ourselves. That's personally, professionally. For many of us, it's the same thing, and then move forward from there. So I think the other thing that I would offer with respect to the overarching question of how can I use this report as a tool to figure out where I'm at, this foundation, this tool, and the report serves as that. It serves as self-reflection, personally, professionally, organizationally. It offers us very tangible questions to be able to ask ourselves, as well as to ask our colleagues, our organizations. Some of those pieces are really important. And I think it also offers us the opportunity and the okaying to prioritize this as an important piece of work. And so I would offer those different pieces as ways that are tangible ways to be able to use the report as a tool in everyone's everyday work or life.
Mhm.
That's great. If I can echo something that I guess both of you said, it's like starting with your own identity. Each of us has identity, and that's also something that doesn't always come up. When Lisa and Lynn and I were on one of the calls, it became very clear to me that we'd made a slight tactical error in the way that we staffed the calls, because it was two Black women talking to a group that was racially diverse, and we really needed the voice and face of a white person on the call, because the white identity was a real thing, and it was difficult for many. One person actually voiced that it was difficult to talk about the issues and not having the language or not having the understanding. And I imagine there probably were people on the call who weren't necessarily thinking of it that clearly, but had a resistance to talking because they weren't mirrored in the call. We all want to be seen. We all want to have our experiences reflected and understood, and we all need that outreach and assurance. Some of us have more expertise and experience being the only person in the room, and we all got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and at the same time trying to set up situations so that we are collective of love. And the other piece I wanted to just underline is safety planning for yourself, because it is difficult to raise issues, and people raise them on our call, and how they would raise an issue and get sidelined or get shamed or criticized, and really making determinations about how you want to move forward in ways that are protecting and supportive of yourself, as well as your values and your commitment to do the work. And yeah, you don't have to do all the work. You're not going to be able to do it all at once, but you can certainly make choices about how you move forward and moving forward in a way that works well for you.
And Camille, I would, I absolutely echo that. In addition to that, I would offer that particular view of the personal and professional. I really wrestled with that, knowing that for me, I feel like they are very intertwined, but at the same time being able to acknowledge that when I was thinking about these self-reflection pieces, some of the questions that we did ask the participants were things like, how do you talk about racial equity work? And I reflected upon that. If I was answering this question as just me, Mona, in my everyday life as I walk my dog around the apartment complex, what would my answer be? And then looking at the answer that I would pose to myself, like, how would I talk about this same racial equity work in a professional context, and looking at those to see, are they the same? Are they different? How are they similar? Evaluating that, right? And so, like, for me, when I was thinking about it, and I'm a holistic person, is my personal different than my professional? Thinking about those two in those two aspects may be the same, may be different for folks. And so I think that that's one of those manifestations of how we bring that personal piece to this work. So I think it's just another way to conceptualize actual practical implications of this tool, and ways that we might think about the way we talk about things and in different spaces and with different folks.
And I think that was one of the things that we heard on the listening sessions from the advocates, saying that they definitely talk differently about racial equity depending on who was in the room and the level of safety that they felt around having the conversation. And so that is one of the things I love about this report, is that there are conversation starters in there, so that, depending on where folks find themselves, being able to discuss this, they can really use some of the conversation starters that are in the report to help them along.
I'm going to bring Tonya and Erika into the conversation. Either neither of you facilitated calls or were part of that, but I'm sure that these conversations sound familiar in other spaces and places. So I'm wondering either if you have thoughts on what you've heard from others so far, or I know this is a big question, but I'm just going to leave it as big. How would you kind of link what we're talking about right now to the broader context of the work, what you've seen, what you do, all of that? So reactions
Sure.
and kind of linking.
Sure. I'm sorry. Did I get started too soon? So let me start off by saying I was so, presenting in public is different than being via webinar. So I started off very stiff. Let me hurry up. I've got other people who have to speak. So let me just rush through this. But I didn't really introduce myself properly. So as everyone else, as Erika demonstrated, and then I totally messed that up after. So let me just identify myself first by saying that I identify as an African American or Black cisgender woman. I'm a survivor of sexual assault, domestic violence, poverty, structural oppression, and many other things. I've been in this work for, my daughter is 22, so I've been in the work for 22 years. I have seen and experienced siloed approaches in the work, which to me is one of the biggest issues is that the work is done in very single issue, very siloed ways. And so I've seen the work done that way, and have had to use the systems myself. And in going through the systems, I experienced, sort of injury in various different ways, because this is how the work is done, when clearly my identity crosses many different places and locations. And so it reinforced for me how important it is to really dive into this work and emphasize the importance of intersectionality, understanding that people have multiple and full and robust identities that should be acknowledged in the services and in the work. And so that leads me then to what Sarah's question. So to kind of chime in on the conversations, in the work I've been with Women of Color Network for 15 years now, and doing this work on a national level. It's so funny, Erika, you and I met right around that. So my gosh, we've known each other for about 15 years. And in doing this work, this national work for that long, there are very few, I think, messages that come up in these reports that I haven't seen, heard, or reported on. So what I love is that we're finding new ways to emphasize and to lift up the issues that folks are seeing in their programs, that survivors are experiencing. And I also can say that from the longevity perspective, this is not new. None of this is news for the movement overall. I think for many individuals, this may be new information, and I'm so excited that we are having this wonderful opportunity to introduce this information. I think there are others who are participating who may not have, who may have heard this for a long time, but are looking for ways to sort of refresh their approaches. I can say that there wasn't that everything that was in the report that folks reported on and shared reflected, much of what I've experienced, which I'm sure Erika has experienced as we've both worked at Coalition together. I mean, we've been in different sort of spaces, in similar spaces, and it reflects pretty much what we and what I know I've seen. And so to just kind of follow up on one thing that Camille mentioned, she talked about, she mentioned how everybody has an identity, right? Everybody has an identity, and that you should start from there. But also every organization has an identity. Every organization has sort of an organizational culture and approach that it does the work. And so linking it to ways that Mona and others have talked about and Zoe have talked about in terms of health. And so, I've started to think about organizations as sort of as organisms, and that, for the overall health of an organization, it's important for the overall organization to engage, to first start with self-reflection. So both individuals would start with a reflection, self-reflection, but then the organization itself would engage in self-reflection. And that it would sort of, in that self-reflection, kind of map this, the folks that, do an internal mapping and internal assessment of who are they reaching, what kinds of folks they are providing accesses and increasing access to, by doing surveys, listening sessions like we're doing now, and other ways that we have conversation, but also then to also reach out into the community and to hear there in terms of what the community feels about the organization, what it does and what it isn't doing. And so really doing that internal and external mapping. And then really kind of it's new to me. And again, there are other folks that have probably thought this way in many years, in many ways, but this idea of manifesting what you want, right? So really doing this concept of what does the organization collectively want to see happen differently, and then sort of manifesting that change. But you have to start by doing that first internally. And one of the biggest sort of cognitive dissonance experiences that I've heard from women of color throughout the years has been, I can't believe my organization is saying that they want to increase and change and work on diversity when I get shut down in my own organization and can't be heard in my own organization, and my expertise is not heard. And so that pairing of both manifesting what you want, but then reflecting that and having that happen first in your organization is very key. And so those are my first thoughts that I wanted to kind of say off the cuff. So Erika, how do you want to jump in?
Thank you, Tonya. There's a lot of ground that I know that we could cover, and I know that you and I have been in dialogue about many of these sort of bigger picture movement questions for quite some time now. Sort of harking back to the piece around organizational position, I think that a lot of what this tool is talking about, and what I think everybody on this call has been talking about, really links to positionality, helping us really recognizing that recognizing one's own position is central to the task of enhancing safety, justice, and agency for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And it is, again, both an inside and an outside job. So, I think I want to talk about that in terms of advocacy practice, but also in terms of some violence against women movement observations. Part of where CSAJ came into this work was when we were working with primarily civil lawyers and advocates across the country who were, for the most part, working within the legal services context. And what we were increasingly seeing was a professionalization and a compartmentalization of violence against women advocacy. So rather than beginning with where survivors themselves find themselves and identify themselves, advocates, attorneys within these institutions were starting with the service that they were going to provide without doing in-depth questioning around sort of whether it was at all relevant, let alone dangerous at times to survivors. And so really it's that compartmentalization and the shift from a movement that really, I believe, should be much more centered in social justice and political analysis, to one that was and oftentimes is right now, we see daily, characterized more by sort of individual service provision. So, the centering of that, I think, really does require sort of a recognition of how racism, sexism, anti-immigrant sentiment, many types of isms really impact and inform and interlock as systems of oppression that have enormous impacts on how services are provided by organizations and how survivors themselves are able to navigate those very systems. So from the outside perspective, I think that sort of critical thinking, whether it's informed by race or by gender or intersectional in nature, examines sort of what the law and the institutions that we currently have, how we can take a closer look at some of the unspoken realities that animate the services that we provide, and really shed light on what drives those systems, institutions, so that we can then change them in a much more impactful way. And I think that the inside piece of the work, very quickly, is more of a focus on the identity of advocates and organizations, and as a critical piece of how we engage in survivor-centered justice-making, agency-making work, recognizing that it's not just the tools that we re-examine, the strategies that we provide, but also the ways in which our own power as lawyers, as advocates, as well as our own oppressions, is fundamental to how we are engaging with survivors as well.
Agreed, Erika, agreed. And so it feels so much like that the tie here, just feels like such a theme on today's webinar has really been about locating yourself, locating your organization, first of all, and then also, listening, right? Listening to survivors, listening to individuals that you're trying to reach, and not assuming that you can sort of develop any approach without first hearing from those that you hope to impact. And so I think that today's conversation has been really wonderful to wrap those pieces up together. The conversation today, in conjunction with the report, I think is fabulous. We've solved all the problems. Let's we're good now.
We can all
Everybody go home.
Let's go home now. But that's all I have to continue to share. I know we need to get to questions.
There we go. Oh, I was talking and realized I was on mute. There's one question I wanted to pose relating to what both you and Erika said, and it's all right there, but there are folks who don't see systems, or they have trouble understanding how systems work, or that they are a part of the system. And I was thinking about what you said with starting with the organizational, looking at the organization as an entity and an organism. If you are a line attorney, or if you are an advocate, or if you are someone who is in a less powerful position in the organization, how do you make forward progress when you don't have the power to make people see? And I think that's one of the questions folks will have who are not organizational leaders. And I've seen examples where, people, a very small group of people can develop understanding together and find ways to demonstrate that systemic impact or demonstrate, paint a picture, tell a story that helps people to get how they're cooperating and being a part of the system. And so I just wanted to put that out there because organizational leaders, I think, are critical in making the space to do this work. If you have less organizational power, you got to be creative about how you raise the issues and how you help people to understand your perspective and understand their need to listen and to see things from different perspectives.
Great.
So I think that the role of narrative is pretty important there. And so if we're thinking about this in the context of working with survivors whose life experiences are not a fit for the systems that they are having to navigate, it means, I think for those who you're describing in particular, there's an opportunity to really shine a light on, elevate, give, amplify and create spaces to share what survivors experience, whether it's in relation to the abuse that they've experienced or their own challenges in navigating systems. I think that, what you also raised reminds me of a comment of somebody we once were at a conference with who was brand new to legal services and said, yes, I am on board, but here's the spot that I occupy. And I think that part of the challenge from an institutional perspective is that they're working within a pretty dominant culture defined context, right? Many mainstream organizations are run that way, and the compartmentalization is not a mistake. So it is difficult, challenging to work within those constraints, and I think that sometimes it's bringing folks in from organizations that aren't approaching advocacy in the same way to show the different ways that it can be done. Drawing on the rich expertise of partners in the work, and creating other sort of showcasing opportunities for challenging sort of the way that things are.
And I would love to hear if anyone else would additionally have any voice on this. But one of the things I wanted to highlight, the reality is that speaking out, questioning systems, the one you're working in, is not the safest location for many folks. It is a risk. It's a risk, and I think that it's important that is why I really understand now how important self-reflection is. I remember I just would jump and do stuff. It really wasn't so much about thinking about it but doing it. But I do think that no matter what stage you are in an organization, it's about being clear about what your principles are and where you're going to stand on something, and do that. But also, Women of Color Network has always equated your preparation in doing that with safety planning. And we think of safety planning as also being within an organization where you could potentially yourself be walking on eggshells once you start to do this. So for example, the idea of bringing somebody in from the outside to talk, if you are a person who people have been questioning why you think you can be a line advocate, but have all of these community connections because you just happen to show up with that, because you have your own personal leadership that you bring to the table that you've been cultivating for years. And when you do that, you can endanger yourself or be involved, not endanger yourself, but you can be endangered, is the way that, the Women of Color Network has talked about the endangerment of the Women of Color advocate. One of those spaces is the idea of that being perceived as challenging the organization or challenging the hierarchy because you have stood on your own leadership and the way that you, in your own experience in life. And when you bring those folks to the table, that could be perceived as coming in direct conflict with the organization and with the leadership. You have to be prepared for that. And then you have to safety plan. You need to have your resume always ready. I don't care who you are. And I don't care who you are.
There you go.
I'm talking about everybody on this webinar, right? And I'm not just talking about women of color. I'm talking about everybody on this webinar. You need to always have, just for self-care purposes, but for safety planning as well. And in this economy right now, and in this climate, always have your resume ready. Always document everything that's happening and any interactions that you're having them in, particularly when they become precarious. And always recognize where you can go to file any complaint that you might have to, because you do have a right to do that under EEOC. Right. And always being able to maintain your slate of connections and relationships. Because this is not necessarily for the faint of heart what we're talking about. I mean, these really are steps. And yet, I'd like to believe that every single person on this call and on this webinar is doing this work because they have a real passion to serve and support survivors. And in that way, you should always be prepared for the pathway. I keep stuttering because I'm trying not to use violent terms and militaristic terms like this war or this battle or whatever it is.
Right.
But I am saying, you should be ready. And so yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a couple of things. I think it might have been Mona who perhaps introduced the concept of putting on your own oxygen mask first. I think the other caveat, or maybe, rule to always take with you, at least for me, is try and bring a buddy, right? For a number of reasons, right? Part of what we are talking about is critical self-reflection as an initial matter, and we can always, as people get in places and have blind spots and other things that we are not reflecting on in ways, we don't see ourselves in ways that other people do. So it's helpful for those purposes. It's helpful for self-care purposes, right? I have a girlfriend who almost every time I see her for a variety of reasons is saying to me, take care of you, right? Because we need to be reminded of that. But I think we also, if we are talking about trying to introduce concepts that could be viewed as problematic or threatening or uppity or out of our place, or however you wish to describe it, within an organization, having someone else maybe within the organization who's willing to do that work with you, who maybe will trade off with you in raising some of the issues or making some of the suggestions about, well, maybe we could get a speaker, or are folks interested in doing the reading? Because I think, Tonya's advice is very well taken about having your resume ready always. But while you're still in that organization, finding ways to share that work, right? Because I think, and this will come up in the report, sometimes it is, the work of racial equity within an organization becomes the work of people who are themselves othered, right? So it's the people of color or the LGBT folks or whoever who are leading the work. And if they want to do it and feel like they have the capacity to do it and feel like they are safe doing it, God bless them, right? But allyship, which is another way of describing what I say when I'm talking about bringing a buddy, right? That's crucial, not only for your mental health, but for making it a lot more difficult for an organization to isolate you as the troublemaker or, the difficult personality. the more places an organization, which may be somewhat stuck or maybe not ready, the more places they're getting the same message from, that's helpful. But the other thing to talk about very quickly from an organizational standpoint is that if you're ready to do this work, you too can get a buddy, right? You can look around in your community and look at some of the organizations doing the work that you might want to do more of, and try and figure out how to partner with them. Maybe whether or not they are willing to come in and sort of help you take a look at your organization and do some auditing to give you some feedback again about how diverse at various levels your organization is or isn't. I was going to say something else, but of course I have forgotten what that is. But I think that it's very important, right? The self-reflection is good, but also having people or other organizations reflect back to you where you are so that you can be moving forward and not, trapped or stuck in a particular place is also very important.
We're getting a lot of feedback on the idea of buddies, partners, allyship, how to do that when you're you've kept up your resume and you've left and now you're in a new environment. And so with our remaining kind of 6 minutes, I know that we had a lot of questions to toss back at attendees here, but are there thoughts on this, or do our conversation partners here, do you have thoughts about what questions you feel like would be most helpful to get or engage with our attendees on?
Can I make one clarification? I just want to make one clarification. When I mentioned the resume, it was not meaning so you can leave. It was meaning in case you find yourself on in some environment or a circumstance where you're not at the organization anymore. So I just wanted to clarify that. But you should also.
But I do want to say, though, I think that a lot of this, wow, we're really short on time. So how can I make this quick? Okay. I think that it's important to have your resume also so that you can stay in touch with your own power and what you do bring. Because when you work in these organizations, just like when you're in any abusive relationship, you start to doubt yourself. And so it's helpful to have that resume and to keep your connections with people, because sometimes you do have to leave, and that's okay. Right. So sometimes it's just good to keep that resume also that you can look at and be like, yeah, I got it going on. There are places I can actually go. I don't have to stay in this abusive relationship. Right. Take the advice that we give to other people.
Right. And I think
you can start your own.
One of the things that,
I just said, and in addition to that, you can start your own organization, which is another piece that WLCN really emphasizes quite a bit.
Right. And one of the things that I would just add really quickly here to this portion of the conversation is that one of the positives of the different levels of functional application of the report is that it allows for all of us to individually have that reflection at the different levels, at the personal, professional, organizational, systems level change, and use that reflection and or next steps to decide how we want to take that, right? And if that's within that greater, larger social change aspect, that might be multiple levels within that organization. Maybe it's something as small, because it can be very overwhelming when you were thinking about what does this all mean, and where do we have our particular voice and power within these pieces. But maybe it's just starting off from your self-reflection and being able to find words, right? At the most basic level, how do we, for me, myself, what words am I using to describe this work and racial equity or racial inequities? How am I talking about that to colleagues? Can I embed this in the work that I'm doing in the variety of my projects? How can I embed it in my professional growth? A lot of organizations have opportunities to kind of prioritize kind of wish list projects or avenues for personal growth. Maybe that's training. Maybe that's a direction that your work is going to be moving towards. And so contemplating that once you've done these reflections, if this is the way that you would, want to explore that growth, maybe these are some of the tangible ways that, you can think about or reflect upon or implement some of these pieces that we've been talking about moving forward from a practical, smaller dosage, right? Because we all are coming from different lenses and different places. So I think those are some pieces for consideration for taking and starting from our place of where we're at and then moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Here. So with our remaining minute, what would feel good? We have a bunch of forward-thinking questions that we can leave with you all. We have some final check-ins that I'll ask our faculty and also from the audience, let us know kind of where you are. What would feel like a good place to kind of land?
It sounds like, Sara, we could just have a brief, round robin with the panelists. You can leave up the forward-thinking reflections so people can have them in front of them, but maybe get a last couple words from us and then wrap up because we will just keep talking.
Great. That sounds good. And I think these forward-thinking reflections, as has been said throughout the call today, I think are reflective of what's in the report. And Camille said earlier, I think in conversation with somebody, that it doesn't provide, there is no one answer, and the report doesn't provide an answer, but it does ask more questions that hopefully feel actionable, given where you are and what level you, kind of how you're entering in all of this. So we're really excited to get your feedback on that when that comes out. So as we do this round robin, I'll ask from all of our panelists, what's one thing you think attendees can do, given this is a big conversation? What's a tangible thing that can be done, and or what's a tip or suggestion for self-care, self-safety planning? And while they do round robin, if our attendees can answer in the chat, kind of what are you taking away from this call? What do you know, or what are you thinking about now that maybe you weren't as much when you before you joined us? So I'll just start from the bottom of my video chart here with Lisalyn, the round robin.
How did I know that I was going to walk the plank? I think that the report will be very helpful. Obviously, you don't have to wait for that. I think that this has been such a rich conversation. But thinking about, I sort of now literally have, because I'm still doing a little bit of work on that piece of the report, I have this guidepost, "You are here" sign embedded in the front of my head. So thinking about where you are or where you would like to see some progress. Is it at your individual advocacy level? Is there something going on in a system that you engage with frequently, right? Like we have done some work with demonstration sites whose clients had problems because they were not native English speakers. And the guidance and the documents that came out of the court were always only in English. So, and that for a court is a matter of, that's how the court does business. That's not necessarily the court being intentionally discriminating. It's just an effect of what the court does. So that organization had to work with the court to make sure that court instructions were available in different languages so that survivors who needed to know when to come back to court or, how long their orders would be valid could actually understand what was being told them. So if you're dealing with a systemic challenge, or if you want to work at your organizational level or whatever, think about where you can begin to sort of slot in or think about some change, and then think about something concrete in that space. And I suppose a quick suggestion for self-care, at least for me, might be meditation or journaling, both of which I aspire to do more consistently than I actually do. Okay, Mona, you're sitting next to me on the screen, so I'm handing to you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I actually just pulled up some of the reflection pieces from our calls, and I was going to end on these two pieces, but I felt like they felt appropriate. One reflection was examine your own bias. That really gets at the heart of, what we revealed within these calls, but also the primary function of the report and its functionality of being a tool for folks, right? And so, examine that, but also continue to do the work. And because we are changing people and life changes and everything, around us changes, we're not stagnant. That we need to continue to do this ongoing work. That was a huge piece that was also reflected in the call, but also that I think that portions of when we're reflecting, particularly with respect to organizational ideas and equity work and our organizational philosophies, that can be helpful, right? Because maybe an organization had a particular lens or did things in a particular way. But as we reflect and challenge ourselves to continue to grow and evaluate our work, these pieces can be potentially reapproached, right, and reevaluated and talked about in a different way that maybe previously weren't. And so those two things I would offer as information and considerations for people.
Thanks, Mona. You want to toss it to someone?
Oops, sorry. Sure, I didn't. Camille.
Hi. Yes, that's great. One tangible thing that attendees can do. I think about this as, as a marathon. Maybe like one of those I can't remember what the triple marathon, like the marathon, bike, and swimming, triathlon. Yeah.
Triathlon.
Yeah, right. So you're training for the triathlon, right? So find things you can do. It's not about fixing the system today. It's about learning to see the system, learning to attack parts of the system, learning to build relationships with folks who can help you to change the system, learning to have longevity and strength and skills and staying power that you will develop over time. Yes. And so perspective, a friend of mine who's he was a longtime activist in another country, basically said, he's doing this work for, not for change in his lifetime, but so that his grandchildren can pick up the torch and keep that change going. So a matter of perspective, because it is frustrating, it is challenging. And if we try to take it all on at once, we will crumble. Or if not crumble, we'll do injury to ourselves. So take the long view. And I think the other thing I would say is get enough sleep, drink enough water, eat regularly, and incorporate life in your work. Because work can become all encompassing, and there's got to be joy, through all of this. So cultivate that. And cultivate it with kind people who will affirm that you are indeed on a path that is worthy and righteous and right.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
I will pass it to Zoe.
I will take it. So I would say one thing is to do things that you really want to do. Have fun and do things that you are passionate about. Find things that you're passionate about and invest in those things and shift more of the things that you do not feel joyful about out of your life and off your table. And with that, I'm going to shift it to Erika.
Okay. I think one of the things that I walk away with, when we were just talking, I think we all had the real benefit of hearing the challenges facing so many advocates of color within organizations, and the safety issues that are connected with challenging the way systems are currently set up. And so I think that one challenge that presents, or that I would sort of share with white allies or aspiring allies or mainstream organization folks who are leaders, is to examine where you can sort of put your finger on a powerful lever, because there is power that can be accessed, and it's a matter of thinking about again, where you're situated and how you can use your power to be effective, whether that's in the framing of issues, right? Very much now we're hearing, white supremacy is a part of our national media conversation. So if we're not framing issues in the context of the intersection between violence against women and white supremacy, we're really losing an opportunity. Similarly, if you're in an organization and you're not thinking about how your own space can be utilized, you're sort of letting go of a opportunity. So how can we use that, lift it up, and turn it into an agentic space?
I think Tonya needs to go next.
Yes, thank you. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. I wanted to be sure I did this properly. So yes, and I'm just going to say a couple of words, and then I do have to walk out. But I want to encourage, and this is not sort of one of those sort of shameless plugs, but I do want to encourage you, to all readers, to so WOCN does a lot of conversation around leadership and around aspiring ally work. And I would like to encourage you to look at some of our publications on our website at WOCNinc.org that really speaks to what it means to be an aspiring ally, and also really speaks to some of the data and some of the research and information that we've uncovered about women of color and folks in across marginalized populations, across disability, sexual orientation, gender identity in various communities across the field, and some of the research that we've done, actually, this is not in our minds. There really are, in some cases, differences in pay, differences in acknowledgement, differences in recognition, and so we'd like to encourage you to look that up, and then and once you get that information, to engage in self-care, because and self-care just means to continue, in my mind, trudging, setting intentions and moving forward on that. Zoe, who is sort of the Zen master for WOCN, I shouldn't use that phrase, but so many of the things I even say now is by having Zoe at our table. And so I'm just, and I know that she really would emphasize this idea of really intention setting. And determining where you want to go, and then moving forward, and that's both on an individual basis, on a organizational basis. And when I mentioned mapping, I'm really talking about sort of creating organizational vision board, right? This is what the vision is for the organization, and not sort of just a statement, but actually, drawing it out, getting your staff together to think about what would it look like to have an organization that really fully addresses racial equity. And if you're not a person who has that sort of access, not so much access, but sort of agency within your organization, you can do that for yourself, and you can share those opportunities and that information as much as you can to try to help set little small waves of change within your organization. So thanks everybody. I'm gonna sign off. Thanks
Bye,
everyone.
Tonya.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Tonya.
Thank you.
Did we get to everyone on the round robin?
Yes, we did.
We did.
Share your thoughts, please, Sara.
Yes, Sara.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm gonna lift up what somebody here just said. Heather mentioned that she's feeling really reinvigorated by this conversation, and I couldn't agree more. So I think a tangible action, I'm really just repeating what others have said, but is to sit down and think about some of these questions that we've laid out, look at the report, Google things, maybe also Google some, cat videos or things that make you happy and bring that spark of joy that Camille was talking about in terms of self-care. I'm settling into my best self in my bath time. So I would highly recommend bubbles. And another thing to do is, again, I'm going to go back to being bold and asking the internal questions and being intentional, like we do with so many other facets of our life, about what that might look like in action and practice in our day-to-day. So I cannot thank all of you enough for being here, all my video friends and all my chat friends for also being here and sharing your work. Please share back with us how you are engaging in this, how you feel in 30 minutes or in 2 weeks, how you kind of grapple with the report. We will also be in touch about ways to engage and stay connected and hopefully provide more opportunities like this. So this is just the launch pad, and I'm really thrilled and feel reinvigorated moving forward. So thank you all, and we'll see ya.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.